Alright guys, today we will go ahead and finish up with the chapter on chemistry. We left off talking about organic compounds. Organic compounds are the compounds that make up the majority of the human body. And they're compounds that always include carbon and hydrogen. They're normally pretty big, and they normally contain some other stuff, like maybe a little oxygen or maybe a little nitrogen. But they always have carbon and hydrogen. We talked about carbohydrates, which are sugars and starches. We use them as fuel for our body. Now we're talking about lipids. There are multiple different types of lipids. Fatty acids are lipids that we also use to fuel our body. Triglycerides are lipids that we use to store fatty acids. That's when we want to store the fat away for later. Now we'll talk about phospholipids. Phospholipids are diglycerides, di meaning two. So there's the glycerol, and then instead of having three tails like a triglyceride, there's just two. So they're diglycerides attached to a phosphate group, and then some sort of like non-lipid head group. So some head part that's not a lipid, it's not a fat. When we look at phospholipids are so important, or the reason they work the way they do is because they have two very different regions. They have this head region up here, and then they have this tail region down here. Their heads are what we call hydrophilic. That literally means water loving. So this top region of the molecule up here likes water. It interacts with water just fine. The tails, the regions that are down here, are what we call hydrophobic. Hydrophobic literally means water fearing. Hydro like water, and a phobia is a fear. Like arachnophobia is a fear of spiders. Right, so hydrophobia or hydrophobic means water fearing. This tail region down here, that's the lipidy part, the fatty part, does not like water, does not want to interact with water. So there are these two parts that are opposite. The head likes water, the tail hates water. That's called amphipathic. Just FYI, when there's two parts that are very different from each other, that's amphipathic. Phospholipids function as the lipids that make plasma membranes or cell membranes for our cells. That's the outer barrier around the outside of the cell. So the whole outer sphere or wall around the outside of the cell is made up of what we call a phospholipid bilayer, or two layers of phospholipids around the outside of our cells. This is kind of a general structure of a phospholipid. Again, there's this lipidy region down here that's hydrophobic. And then there's this head region up here that's non-lipid. And that area is hydrophilic. That area likes water. This is an example of one function or one thing that phospholipids can do. Phospholipids can group together to form these little structures called micelles. And these allow for like fatty type things to travel through the bloodstream okay. When you look at this, notice that the heads are all on the outside like this. And the heads, we said, like water, right? So inside is all the tails, and the tails are fatty. They don't like water. That's why they're all going to the inside to try and get away from this water that's out here. So this could be anything in the body. Our body is filled with water. So this could be the blood. This could be the interstitial fluid, the fluid outside of our cells. It could be anything. But if we have something really fatty that we need to push through the bloodstream, that fatty thing is not going to like the water of the bloodstream. So we can put it inside one of these micelles. The fatty structure that will be happy in here because it's surrounded by fats. It's nice and happy because it's surrounded by something that's similar to it. And then this micelle, this structure, can travel through the water just fine because the whole outside has these heads that like water, so they're perfectly happy. So phospholipids form micelles. Again, they also form the plasma membrane or barrier around the outside of our cells. We see that they arrange themselves in two layers so that the heads are on the outsides of the membrane like that, and then the other layer is like this, and the tails stretch in towards the center of the cell membrane like this. Right? And that goes around the whole cell, right? It makes up the whole cell membrane. Now this works because inside the cell is filled with water and outside the cell is also filled with water. So the head regions, the parts of these phospholipids that like water, are always on the outside edges of the membrane, and then their tails go in towards the center, and that way they don't have to interact with the water. And that's how the plasma membrane or cell membrane is formed. Continuing on with lipids, right, our fatty structures or fatty compounds. The last lipid we'll talk about is steroid. Steroids, there are all different types of steroids, and steroids all have the same kind of structural feature. They all have 4 carbon rings. So there will be like these rings that have carbon. They're made up of carbon, and they all have the same 4-ring structure. And then there will be different things that stick off of it, and that's what makes them different. But if you see 4 carbon rings, you know that's a steroid. The different types of steroids include cholesterol. I'm sure you guys have all heard of cholesterol, and people typically think of it as being bad, right? Like, oh no, I have high cholesterol. But you need some cholesterol. Some cholesterol is healthy. It's necessary for life. We do have some cholesterol in our plasma membranes, for example. And cholesterol is a precursor to making other hormones or other steroids. A lot of hormones are actually steroids. A lot of hormones have this 4-ring structure, and they're lipids. Examples include the sex hormones, the hormones that we use as part of our reproductive system. So this includes estrogens, progesterones, testosterones, which are the male sex hormones. And then other hormones also, we have a couple other hormones that are also steroid hormones. This includes corticosteroids, like cortisol, which we kind of call the stress hormone, and then calcitriol. Corticosteroids control metabolism in the body, so they control different types of chemical reactions. And calcitriol is a hormone that's involved in regulating calcium concentrations. So calcitriol controls calcium concentrations in the body. But the point is that all of these, the hormones as well as the cholesterol, these are all steroids. They all have the 4 carbon rings in common, and we classify them as lipids. Here you see examples of different steroids. Okay, so cholesterol, estrogen, testosterone. Notice they all have the 4 carbon rings, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. They have different stuff sticking off of them. So cholesterol's got this really long chain up there, whereas testosterone just has an OH. Estrogen just has an OH. So they have different functional groups, but they all have those 4 carbon rings. All right, so changing gears, we're going to move on from lipids and talk about proteins. Proteins are some of the most abundant organic molecules, and they're very versatile. Versatile meaning that they have all different functions. There are all different types of proteins that do all different types of things. Proteins are very large. They're very, very big organic compounds, and they're made up of smaller building blocks called amino acids. So we string together tons and tons of amino acids, and that gives us one protein. This is why they're so big. We could have 300, 400 amino acids all coming together to make one single protein. Now we have 20 different types of amino acids, right? So we arrange them in different orders to get different proteins. but all proteins are made out of these same 20 amino acids. It just, the different proteins have a different number of them. So they could have 100, 150, 200, 300, whatever. And these 20 amino acids are in a different order in the different proteins. Each of these amino acids has the same basic structure. Each amino acid has a like a central carbon in the middle, a hydrogen sticking off of that. It has a nitrogen coming off, so NH3, and then it has a carboxylic acid like this. Okay, so they all share this structure with a carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. Where they're different from each other is down here. This is the area where the different amino acids are different. Here you see a basic amino acid, right? Exactly what I just said. There's this amino group with the nitrogen. That's why it's called an amino acid. There's this carboxyl group. Those are also called carboxylic acids. That's where the acid comes from. It's got the amino group and the acid. It's called an amino acid. And then again, this is where the different amino acids are different from each other. It could be something simple like an OH, could be a CH3, it could be something really big. There's 20 different versions of these amino acids. Again, for our point, or for our purposes, the point is that we put many of these amino acids together to make a protein. So many of these makes a protein. They all get linked together. Okay, one after the next, after the next, after the next, to make a huge chain. And that eventually is going to give us a protein. Protein shape is very important to protein structure. The protein on a molecular level has to have the perfect shape in order to work. So if there's just one little thing off in the shape, the protein's not going to function anymore. It's not going to work. And because they're so large, protein shape is very, very complex. There's not an easy way to describe it. You can't just say, oh, you know, it's a pentagon or it's a hexagon. They're huge. They're very complex. So when we talk about the shape of proteins, we break it up into steps, like into levels. And there's the primary structure, secondary structure, tertiary, and quaternary. The primary structure of a protein is just the sequence of amino acids along a polypeptide. A polypeptide is just the term we use when we have many amino acids attached to each other. We call that a polypeptide. Poly like many. And we say peptide because the bond between them is called a peptide bond. So like many bonds is a polypeptide. And then that polypeptide eventually becomes a protein. So primary structure is just what amino acid you have where. So it's just saying like we have, you know, one amino acid and then this one and then this one and then this one. And it just shows you the specific pattern of amino acids. That's the primary structure. Then what ends up happening is, remember, these amino acids aren't just simple squares. They're actual atoms, right? Like there's a hydrogen, there's a nitrogen, there's stuff sticking off of them. And these atoms end up having attraction to other atoms in the sequence. Hydrogen bonds start to form. And that pulls this linear structure into a spiral. So instead of having a straight line like this, it ends up twisting and turning and spiraling. Or it can fold back and forth. But the point is, instead of a straight line, the molecule starts to get pulled into another shape. That's the secondary structure. Then that spiral that was formed gets twisted into its own completely different, unique shape. So instead of like a spiral like this, that would be the secondary structure. The tertiary structure occurs when that spiral goes into its own weird, unique shape. Finally, the quaternary structure, the final protein shape, happens when we put several of these tertiaries together. So we might have, you know, 2 or 3 or 4 of these tertiaries that come together to make the final protein. Okay, super big, super complex, and shape matters. Now, the sequence of amino acids, right? This original primary structure, putting the right amino acid in the right place, is very important. Because if you had, like, say this amino acid was the wrong one, and it didn't have the right atom sticking out right here, well, then it wouldn't form the right bond, which means it wouldn't curl into the right shape, right? So the sequence of amino acids has to be perfect in order for the protein to end up being the right shape, in order for it to work correctly. Okay, this is really important. Our DNA in our cells, right, your genetic material that you inherit from your parents, your DNA contains the recipes, the instructions for how to make these proteins, right? It tells your cells which amino acids go where. That's why your DNA is so incredibly important. Here you guys see that? Again, these are just proteins. So the primary structure is just the amino acids in a line. The secondary structure happens when these hydrogen bonds start to pull those amino acids into a spiral or into this folded pleated shape. The tertiary structure occurs when that spiral then curls into its own unique 3D shape. And then the quaternary structure, final protein structure, occurs when you put multiple of those tertiary structures together. So this protein, for example, has 1, 2, 3, 4 of these tertiary structures put together to make this one final protein. That happens to be hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein that's present in our red blood cells. This is the thing that carries oxygen and carbon dioxide through your bloodstream. So super important. This is a more simple protein, like a fibrous protein. You can see how organized it is into this nice straight strand. That's the structure. That's what like keratin and collagen look like. Those are the things that make our hair and our nails strong. Okay, sorry, I feel like I'm talking super fast. The last type of organic compound that we're going to talk about is the nucleic acid. Nucleic acids, I just kind of mentioned, I mentioned DNA. But nucleic acids are, again, very large organic molecules that we use to store our genetic information. So we store all of the info we inherit from our parents, and we use nucleic acids to process that information. So to actually use that genetic information. The two types of nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. DNA, the actual term for DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA has a sugar in it called deoxyribose. So that's where that term comes from. Deoxyribose and deoxyribonucleic acid. Sorry, I'm trying to erase and I just cannot make it work. So that's a mess, my bad. RNA has a sugar called ribose. So ribonucleic acid has ribose. So DNA. DNA contains the genetic code that you inherit from your parents. It determines all of your inherited characteristics. So your basic stature or size and shape, the color of your hair, the color of your eyes, the color of your skin, all of that is coded in your DNA. Your DNA also contains coded instructions that specify the structure of each protein. Hey, again, your DNA is like a cookbook or a recipe book. for how to make proteins. It contains the recipe for each individual protein.